Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GBNews,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up this morning on the political correction, we're talking about the NATO summit, which took place in Madrid earlier this week, Halifax introducing pronouns on staff name tags, and babies in the Houses of Parliament. That plus plenty more after your latest headlines with Ray.
Thanks, Arlene. Good morning. Just after 10 a.m, here's the latest from the GB Newsroom. Several new allegations of inappropriate behaviour have been made against the former Conservative MP Chris Pincher. 6 new claims have emerged just days after he resigned from his role as Deputy Whip and was suspended from the party after allegedly groping 2 men. The latest allegations, which stretch back more than a decade, were reported in several newspapers this morning, claiming he made unwanted advances to male MPs. No official complaints were ever received, and he's denied the allegations to newspapers. Mr Pincher says he's currently seeking professional medical support, but insists he will remain as an MP. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor have outlined what they're calling the single biggest tax cut in a decade. Writing a joint article in The Sun on Sunday, they say Wednesday's rise in the national insurance threshold from just under £10,000 to just over £12,500 a year will save 30 million British workers up to £330 a year. The government also plans to provide relief for council tax bills, fuel duty and energy costs. Vicky Price, Chief Economist Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research, told GB News the cuts don't go far enough.
Indeed, I think the discussion which is going on right now is what to do with VAT in particular. Yes, the Chancellor is saying that, and the Prime Minister, that we're cutting taxes because we're increasing the threshold for national insurance contributions for when you start paying them. But in reality, those national insurance contributions have gone up. So they've given back something, but they're taking away a lot more overall. So it's not necessarily a tax cut as such when you look at the overall context.
The government wants security checks on new airport workers to be treated as a priority to prevent travel delays this summer. The Department of Transport claim counter-terrorist checks are being processed in record times as shortages of baggage and security staff fuel hold-ups. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says people have made huge sacrifices during the pandemic and deserve their flights to run on time. Travel expert Simon Calder told GB News the situation is still causing serious delays.
And there's a huge blame game going on with the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps saying to the airlines,
you spent 2 years saying all you want to do is fly people around and to the airports as well. You just want people to be able to travel. As soon as they can, it all falls apart. But they say, look, actually, we suffered the most serious travel restrictions of any European country.
The government's spending watchdog is planning to investigate the Prime Minister's 2019 election pledge to build 40 new hospitals by the end of the decade. It's after the Shadow Health Secretary warned the plans are a waste of taxpayers' money, with many hospitals having alterations or refurbishments instead of actually being new. Wes Streeting has also criticised delays, with NHS trusts still waiting for funds to be allocated. Russia says at least 3 people have been killed and 4 injured in the Russian city of Belgorod, near the Ukraine border. The area's regional governor says at least 11 apartment buildings and 39 homes were damaged, with 5 destroyed. However, the reports are yet to be independently verified. Meanwhile, President Zelensky says Russia's attack continues to focus on the Donbas region.
There is a sense of relaxation in many rear cities now, but the war is not over. It is there. Unfortunately, its brutality sometimes only grows, and we must not forget about it. Brutal hostilities continue along the entire front line. In Donbass, the epicenter, of course, in the cities of Luhansk region. Hostile activity is intensifying in the Kharkiv region.
Cyberbullying may be playing a key role in keeping mortality rates high among people with asthma. A study from Nottingham University Business School says online abuse fuels a vicious cycle, meaning those with the condition trivialise it and can be less likely to take their medication. Thousands of Australians have been ordered to evacuate parts of Sydney after torrential rain brought intense flooding. Vehicles have been left marooned and sports fields turned into lakes, with the Met Office warning the downpour will intensify over the next 2 days. And Wimbledon will have tennis on the middle Sunday of the tournament for the first time in its history. British players Heather Watson and Cameron Norris will both be in action, making their debuts in the last 16. The centenary of Centre Court is also being celebrated at the All England Club, with previous winners making special appearance alongside refugees from Ukraine, Syria and Afghanistan. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. This is The Political Correction. I'm Arlene Foster, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry. So we're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is certainly not about journalists talking to journalists. It's about you telling us what you think. So what's coming up this hour? We are discussing the NATO summit, which took place this week in Madrid, where leaders discussed plans of how to deal with the potential future Russian aggression. We'll be talking about the controversy surrounding Halifax after they told customers they're free to close their accounts with the bank if they disagree with their policy to include pronouns on staff name tags. And we will be discussing babies in Parliament after the Procedure Committee said it was not an environment for very young children. And as ever here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on the show, then email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is... So NATO leaders met this week in Madrid to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which commenced back in February. A big talking point was Turkey agreeing to support Sweden and Finland's membership of the alliance, prompting the Kremlin to reinforce their viewpoint that NATO is an aggressive, expansionist organisation with imperialistic ambitions. Before the much-anticipated meeting in Madrid, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that Vladimir Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if he were a woman, claiming that the invasion was a perfect example of toxic masculinity, as he called for more women in positions of power. So, Paul, first of all, let's talk about where we are in Ukraine. How provoking could an expansion of NATO be, do you think?
Well, potentially very. And I'm concerned, Arlene, we're seeing a lot of sabre rattling at the moment, aren't we? We're seeing a lot of stoking of tensions as far as I can see. I mean, I've said all along the invasion was wrong. It's barbaric. There's no question about that. But I just wonder if NATO and the West and the EU haven't added fuel to the flames in some respects. I mean, I think we're at a position where we need to be looking to dampen the tensions to a certain degree. And some voices have tried to do that, I think, in recent months, not least the likes of His Holiness the Pope, for example. But those efforts don't seem to be making the media and getting much publicity. And it seems to me that the bellicosity and the inflammatory rhetoric is just making things worse. And I think as well, when you look at the overtures that NATO and the EU are now making towards Ukraine, I think if you look at the fact that America is pumping vast amounts of money into Ukraine and arms, and the UK is doing a very similar thing, I think it's making the argument that this is not a proxy war almost untenable. Now, people have got all sorts of different views on Ukraine. Most people agree rightly, I think, that the invasion by Russia was wrong. But those who say that it isn't a proxy war, I think, are losing the argument, because if you look at the way that the West largely has formed up in ranks alongside Ukraine, and isn't just giving tacit support, but very, very active support in terms of arms and money, etc., then how can we realistically argue that it isn't a proxy war? And I'm also uncomfortable, I've got to say, at the nature of the debate, where all of the angels are being presented as on one side and all of the devils on the other. I mean, there's a whole history to this conflict. It didn't just start in February, it started effectively 8 years ago, and we're not seeing much of that backstory in the media, and that's not helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right. But if you're living in Finland or you're in Sweden, of course you want to be a part of a defence union when you see what has happened in Ukraine, don't you? You want to have that security of being in NATO, and that's why they applied to be a part of NATO.
Well, I don't buy the argument that Russia has got these great kind of expansionist plans that unless the likes of Sweden or Finland were in NATO, then Russia at some point would march in. I mean, there are a particular set of circumstances around Ukraine. There's a historical dispute. You have a large number of ethnic Russians living in the Donbass region. Russia felt rightly or wrongly that those people were being mistreated by the Ukrainian government. So there's a backstory there that doesn't apply to the likes of Sweden and Finland. And I also think the idea that Russia is anything like the kind of power and force of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, has anything like the wherewithal militarily, economically as the old Soviet Union, or has any of those kind of expansionist plans, I just think is fanciful. And I think NATO and the EU making these kinds of overtures are is just ramping up the situation rather than dampening the tensions.
Although you say fanciful, but we all know that Putin has written about, wanting to have a greater Russia and a larger Russia, as in a historical Russia. So, I mean, from my perspective, I can understand why Finland and Sweden, having such a long border with Russia, are concerned about this particular leader of Russia and the way in which he has moved into Ukraine. And you're right, I mean, this didn't start in February, it started back in 2014, or probably before that, if you take your point about what was happening in Ukraine at that time. But 2014, he invaded, very little happened. Then he makes his move in Ukraine, the wider Ukraine, in February. And I think people are worried about what's his next move if he succeeds in Ukraine, and that's why NATO seems to be a comfortable place for Finland and Sweden.
Well, I just don't buy the argument that if Sweden and Finland were not part of NATO, then they would be exposed to a Russian invasion. I simply don't see that happening. I think politically it would be suicidal for Russia to do something like that. I just don't.
Well, you could say that about the invasion of Ukraine, but I mean, he did it anyway.
Yeah, and I think, look, I mean, the truth is, look at how Russia has become bogged down in Ukraine. So I think that itself militates against the argument that Russia is this kind of all-conquering power, potentially. Russia went into Ukraine in February. It's been pushed back from Kiev. It's now concentrating its forces in the eastern region, in the Donbass. All those who said that Russia would roll Ukraine over in a few weeks have been proved wrong, and I think that itself is proof positive that actually, unlike the Soviet Union, which went into places like Czechoslovakia, that went into places like Hungary and rolled those countries over pretty quickly, the mere fact that Russia has been bogged down now for 5 months or whatever it is and doesn't seem to be advancing very far, I think is proof enough that we're not talking about the old Soviet Union. And the example I've used before, Arlene, and I'll use it again, is if for example, the Soviet Union and China decided to enter into Russia and China decided to enter into some sort of military alliance, and a country that was close to the United States, whether it was Cuba or Mexico or Canada, had sympathy towards that alliance and made some sort of security pact with it. Anyone who says to me that the White House in those circumstances would just say, well, that's fine, you're a sovereign country, you're perfectly entitled to enter into whatever military alliance you like, even though it's on our own border, I think he's talking nonsense. We know exactly what the reaction of the White House would be in that situation. And I just don't think we've thought deeply enough about what the response, not just of Putin, but of ordinary Russians, of seeing NATO come closer and closer to its border. Bearing in mind that NATO was set up very explicitly as an anti-Soviet institution. None of that, by the way, I reiterate, none of that is to defend the invasion, which is wrong, which is barbaric, but it is about trying to place it in a greater context than a lot of the media seem willing to do.
Yeah, we should say, of course, there was that horrific attack on Kremenchuk this week when missiles came in from Russia. 1,000 people out shopping in a shopping mall, 13 people dead, many injured. And the barbarity of this war continues, even though I have to say it isn't on our screens as much as it was back in February and March, but the barbarity is still there and it is a war that continues. But just talking about the war continuing, did you see the comments from the Prime Minister where he said if Putin had have been a woman, it wouldn't have happened? What did you make of that?
I mean, I just thought it was complete nonsense, frankly. and he used this phrase, didn't he? Toxic masculinity. And you kind of think, where is he getting that stuff from? Who is feeding that stuff to him? I mean, on a practical level, it's clearly nonsense because there have been women leaders who have gone. I mean, Margaret Thatcher sent an entire task force to the Falkland Islands, for example. And I have to say, I think it's slightly patronising and slightly demeaning to women to say that they wouldn't necessarily be strong leaders. They wouldn't necessarily be willing to use their military in defence of their country. Again, that's not to say that what Putin did was the right thing. But I thought it was nonsense, and you have to wonder...
Well, I was really surprised by it, I have to say, given that the PM always likes to pride himself on his knowledge of history and the fact that Catherine the Great from Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, I mean, sorry. What about Catherine the Great? I felt like saying, but anyway, I just think it wasn't nonsense.
Exactly, and I just don't think it's helpful because it doesn't actually allow you to when you can just dismiss it by saying, well, Putin invaded because he was a man.
Yes.
That to me just seems to dismiss what are what should be very serious contextual arguments about why the conflict exists, why he thought he was right to go in, how we get out of it. Don't reduce it to people's biological sex. It's gone.
No, I couldn't agree more. I thought it was mad. But in any event, staying with Ukraine and what's been happening, the head of the British Army has said that we are facing our 1937 moment. What did you make of that?
Well, I just think it plays into what I said, that actually this kind of rhetoric I just don't think is helpful. I mean, first of all, I don't buy that this is a 1937 moment. I mean, I just simply don't accept that when you compare what was happening in Germany in the 1930s in terms of the very rapid militarisation, in terms of the very, very clear expansionist plans that Germany had under Hitler in terms of the treatment of the Jews, for example. It seems to me that whenever there's a conflict, Godwin's law, isn't it? We always kind of liken it to the Second World War, no matter that there isn't much of a resemblance or an overlap. It just seems to me to be the easy thing that people do. And I just think it's lazy. I think the comparison is trite. I think that what we've got is a conflict in the east of Europe, which I think is sensitive to the facts of that particular conflict, whatever side of the debate you're on, which has a particular set of circumstances, a particular historical backstory, and that the rest of us across the world need to try to help to resolve as soon as possible. The idea that Putin is the kind of threat to us that Hitler unquestionably was, I just think is a glib way of looking at the situation.
Well, I thought it was also not just about Ukraine, but a wider reference to the state of our armed forces and where they're at the moment. And as you know, the Defence Secretary has asked for more money from the Treasury for our Defence Minister. I think it's about 2.2, 2.3 at the moment in terms of GDP. If you go back to 1937, this was a point that Simon Heffer is making in the Sunday Telegraph today. Defence spending in 1937 was at 3.66 of GDP. So it shows you at that, if you like, nadir of where we were before the Second World War, we were actually spending more than we're spending now in defence. And I think that is concerning, is it not?
Well, and our own armed forces over recent years have been ravaged, Arlene. And you know, that slightly worries me that we're throwing around security commitments like confetti. I mean, Boris Johnson said recently that he wanted to invest so much in Ukraine that he could effectively guarantee their protection from invasion in perpetuity, almost. And also, I think, said that Britain would come to the aid of Sweden. Now, OK, you know, you can argue that that's a point of principle, but practically, when we've seen our own armed forces eviscerated over recent years and cut to the bone, are we in any sort of position to be making these sorts of commitments? And I just think that most people's view in this country is that, look, our defence forces are there to react when there is a genuine threat to us. And the other thing, which I found really interesting, is that the government has decided that the spending on Ukraine, the amount it's spending on Ukraine in terms of military support, will be absorbed into the UK's own defence budget and will be considered to be part of the UK's own defence budget. So again, that raises the question, well, how can we realistically argue that this is not a proxy war when we are saying that what we are investing in Ukraine will be considered part of our own defence budget? It seems to me that argument's becoming increasingly unsustainable.
Yeah, so actually, smoke and mirrors, we're not actually spending 2.5% of GDP on our own defence. We're actually spending it in Ukraine. Well, so actually, we're probably spending less on defence if you take that out of it.
Yeah, and I think as well, you know, you can speak to, as I do occasionally, you speak to people in the armed forces and they talk about some of the issues around equipment, some of the issues over pay and conditions. So, you know, why have we got a situation where the Prime Minister of this country is throwing around commitments like confetti to other countries saying, you know, we will come to your aid, when on the ground, in terms of our own armed forces, there is, I think, a serious lack of funding. We've seen them be ravaged over recent years. Soldiers, sailors, airmen don't get the pay that they deserve. Some of those issues, I think, need to be resolved first.
And indeed some of the veterans' issues as well, but no doubt we'll be talking about those for quite some time to come. So coming up after the break, we'll be discussing the controversial decision from Halifax to include pronouns on staff name tags. And of course, we want to hear from you today on the political correction. So if you want to get involved in the conversation, email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at GBNews.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go? Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GBNews, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. So, Halifax has told their customers that they're free to close their accounts with the bank if they disagree with their values, after some hit out at a policy to include pronouns on staff name tags. The company shared a picture on social media of one of its badges, which had Gemma written on it with she, her, hers underneath. And the move was praised by leading LGBTQ plus charity Stonewall as a way to make sure identities are respected. Paul, did we need name tags to make identities respected?
Oh, where's it going to end, Arlene?
I don't know.
Where is it all going to end? I mean, look, I'm a great believer that people should be free to live their lives within the law in the way that they want. And, you know, of course, you want to defend people against any sort of persecution or oppression. But the question that I would raise over this kind of nonsensical debate about pronouns is how much can mainstream society be expected to abandon everything it has ever known and learned in the way of science and biological reality and language and custom, just to indulge the whims of what is a very, very tiny number of people. And the truth is that this kind of gender theory is still very much a hotly disputed theory. And what I find staggering is that so many of our big companies, our public services, our institutions have embraced it almost as if it's some kind of conventional wisdom and peddle it publicly, almost as if everybody is on board with it. And the truth is that not everybody is on board with it, particularly women who see the kind of advance of this genderism and know that it's going to impact in terms of their own safety and security, in terms of their own private single-sex spaces and so on. So the likes of Halifax and HSBC now, who have come out in support of Halifax, I think need to understand that they're really out of kilter with mainstream society on this sort of thing.
And, you know, we were talking about this before we came on air, but HSBC is a global company. They're right across the world. And they will be in places where even homosexuality is not accepted. I'm thinking of places like the Middle East, for example. Yet they preach to us here in the UK, but they wouldn't dare do that in the Middle East. They wouldn't dare do it.
Their principles are selective, in which case they're not principles at all, are they? Because if they abandon their principles when they think their profits might be hit, then they're really not principles to begin with. And actually, you know, you see a lot of companies who will quite happily put the Pride logo on social media, you know, above their own logo. But when it comes to their Middle East branches, they don't do that because they know that actually that might not go down too well. So what you have is companies preaching to us when they think, you know, it's fine, it's not going to hit their profits. But if they think it's going to hit their profits, all of a sudden those principles are abandoned, and I don't find that particularly something that should be respected.
And it was good to see Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister, today writing, I think, in the Telegraph again, around the fact that all government buildings are going to have single-sex spaces in toilets. I think that's a good move, isn't it?
I think it's absolutely a good move. And, you know, speaking as a husband and a father, as much as I want to defend people's right to live their lives within the law in the way that they please, and I do, if you say to me that somebody who was born a biological man is going to go into a changing room or to a toilet facility where my 12-year-old daughter is present, then I can assure you I'll be raising a pretty serious fuss about that. And I have to say, I think most people in my position would. So, yeah, I think she is right to make that point.
I think Kemi has been listening and looking at what's going on and has decided to make this point today, and I think it is a very good point. But we are going to move on to another story in the House of Commons, because this week the chair of the Procedure Committee, Karen Bradley, gave a statement on the committee's report into allowing babies into the Houses of Parliament, reaffirming the guidance that the Chamber, Westminster Hall and standing committees are not environments for very young children. But the group also said that there should be a degree of de facto discretion that should be exercised sparingly. Well, to discuss this story further, we're now joined by councillor and former Conservative advisor Claire Pearsall. Claire, good to see you this morning. What do you make of this committee's report? Do you agree with the decision?
Yes, I do. I'm so pleased that they've come out with that, because I've long thought that the Chamber of the House of Commons is not a suitable place to have babies. This is a workplace first and foremost. So to take children into the chamber where the most important matters are being discussed is just a distraction. And no other workplace would you see it. So why does it have to apply to the House of Commons?
Yeah, and I agree with that. Obviously, as someone who has had 3 children and has worked in a legislature, I never thought for a moment that it was an appropriate place to bring them into that chamber, not least because I would have been completely distracted and I wouldn't have been concentrating on the job at hand, Claire. That's the point.
It is. And, you know, I have a 13-year-old, and when he was a lot smaller, I did have to take him into the House of Commons to go to work when some childcare fell through at the last minute. But it wasn't the most productive day that I've ever had, and I am so incredibly grateful that my boss let me do it. But it's not something that you can do long term. As an emergency feature, absolutely, women have to do that, parents have to do that if necessary. But to make this a part of life in the House of Commons, I think is just wrong. And as I say, there are many, many parents out there in the country just looking at this saying, I can't do this. I cannot take my child into work. Why should these people be any different? Why are we not looking at childcare arrangements for parents? Surely that's got to be a much better debate to have.
So those who would support bringing children into the chamber, and Stella Creasy is a perfect example, would argue that we're just reinforcing the impression that Westminster isn't a 21st century workplace. That's her argument, Claire. What do you have to say to that?
I do think that she's got some point to make. Westminster is not a normal workplace. It wasn't set up for women. It has changed enormously. And I believe the Procedure Committee's report doesn't state that breastfed babies cannot be taken into the chamber. That is at the discretion of the chair. And that remains so. And there are also other measures put in place. There are proxy voting. There's an uplift in MPs' expenses for more staff to support them on maternity leave. So I do think that this is a little bit of virtue signalling by Stella Creasy at the moment. It isn't necessary and actually brings the debate about women in the workplace back at least 20, 30 years. And that can't be a good thing.
Yeah, so would you agree with me, Claire, that part of the problem with this whole discussion is that if you're an MP, you should get special privileges, whereas if you're working in Tesco's, well, you have to arrange childcare, and that's what you do?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I don't see why MPs should be any more special than anybody else. We have all had to make sacrifices when we have children, whether they be right or wrong. You can debate that matter till the cows come home. But MPs should not be treated as some kind of special entity. Yes, we might need to look at working hours. I think that is ripe for discussion at the moment. But to suggest that they have some kind of special privilege status above everybody else is just wrong.
Yeah. Well, Claire, thank you for giving us your views this morning. It's really good to see you, and thanks for coming on the show. Paul, just briefly, I mean, nobody's denying that there needs to be a workplace in Westminster which can facilitate those who have families, and that creches should be made available at a workplace. But taking a baby into the House of Commons?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're discussing affairs of state in your legislature, then frankly, the idea that you potentially have babies screaming or toddlers running around, I think is just plain silly. So of course you can't have a situation where you have babies and toddlers in the chamber. You wouldn't do it if you were going in to meet the chief executive, if you were having some sort of conference. And I don't see why it should be done there. I mean, it's absolutely right. I think that where employers are able to, they provide decent facilities such as creches. And I think the argument for Parliament to provide a creche right up until the point, because of MPs vote until late in the night in Parliament, if that means that the creche should be opened until late in the night to cater for that, then absolutely right. But no, the babies in the chamber thing, I think, is a nonsense.
Wow. I can think of nothing worse, and I'm sure my children would agree with me as well. But coming up after the break, we will be discussing former Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher and, of course, those assault allegations made against him. But as ever, here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you today. So if you want to get involved in the conversation, do email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at GBNews.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. And as always, you've been getting in touch in a huge number this morning. So here we are. First of all, Adrian says on Putin, I take Paul's point about what if the situation was reversed and a nation friendly to Russia, such as Mexico. How would America feel? I do agree. However, I don't think America would invade their neighbour, does Paul? If not, surely the fault is with how Russia has dealt with the perceived slight. Paul?
Well, I would say to Adrian, with respect, if you say that America wouldn't invade its neighbour, then you really don't know anything about the history of American intervention in Central America and South America since the Second World War. America does not shy away from intervening, even not necessarily militarily, but certainly covertly sometimes, in order to get its way. And of course, you know, it's also done it further afield in places like Iraq. On the Halifax pronoun story, Les says, I haven't closed my account. I keep it open with a £2 balance. See how they/her/she likes that.
Yeah,
very good, Les.
They're entering into the spirit of the discussion, absolutely. Peter says on the Halifax pronouns, like so many big companies before them, the Halifax has fallen for the virtue signalling woke nonsense. Why are these companies so desperate to label people? It's causing so much division and anger in society.
You have to wonder if they think they're speaking on behalf of the majority when they do stuff like this. Are they so out of touch with mainstream society that they peddle something thinking that everybody's going to be supportive of them, or they're just perhaps worried if they don't do it that there's going to be a noisy minority who will call for a boycott of them?
And there is a noisy minority, let's be honest about that. You know, when people fall foul of that all the time.
I mean, groups like Stop Funding Hate, for example, very much in the minority, but because they're quite well organised, because they've got a presence on social media, they can whip up a Twitter storm which petrifies some big companies because they think, oh, this could really impact on our profits. So what you end up seeing, and I think this is an example of it with the Halifax, is big companies indulge in the small minority, but vocal minority, because they think they've got more potential to create a backlash against them than the silent majority, possibly. On Babies in the Chamber, Ben says, I do not feel there should be any degree of relaxation for anyone in this. As we've seen all the time, if an exception is made for one, others will say it's discriminatory. Children are not allowed in the workplace, full stop. Work is a place to work, not to parent your children.
Yeah, well, obviously I've made my views very clear on that. I very much agree with that, Ben. But we're going to move on now and to stay in Parliament and Westminster. Former Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher has been suspended as a Conservative MP after allegedly groping two men in a private members' club, and will sit as an independent after he was reported to Parliament's behaviour watchdog. He left his government job on Thursday, saying in a letter that he had, quote, drunk far too much and embarrassed himself and other people. His suspension comes after two senior Conservative MPs, Caroline Noakes and Karen Bradley, wrote to the Chief Whip demanding a zero-tolerance approach to sexual misconduct. 6 new claims of inappropriate behaviour emerged over the weekend. Paul, where does this all end? Where are we going?
I mean, my view, Arlene, is if any MP is guilty of sexual assault in the way that has been alleged here, then you have no place in Parliament, as far as I'm concerned. If you're an MP, you have a duty, I think, to set a higher standard than everybody else. I have been, over the last couple of years, slightly uncomfortable at some of the debate around it, where I felt that things that clearly didn't fall into the category of sexual assault were, in some cases, being treated as that. So, you know, a bit of mild flirting, for example, exchanging text messages, which were perhaps a little bit near the mark, putting your arm around somebody's shoulder. And we saw, you know, in response to some of that stuff, the Me Too movement, where almost any sort of interaction was seen as something that was resembling sexual assault. And I think we need to push back against some of that stuff. However, where the allegations, and if they're proven, are of clear sexual assault, then frankly, get out of Parliament. You cannot do that as an MP. You know, just because you are in a powerful position, it doesn't give you the right to treat people like that. And if you do so, then you've got no place in the chamber, in the Commons, in the legislature.
But we're discussing this all the time. Back in April, you'll remember that Anne-Marie Trevelyan came forward and said that, you know, she'd been pinned against a wall by a male MP. And then Suella Braverman was also talking about the toxic scene at Westminster. Ben Wallace said, you know, it was a toxic mix of factors with alcohol and behaviour. But, you know, it's not about alcohol. It's about holding self-responsibility here, is it not? I mean, that's the key to all of this. It
is, and, you know, I don't want MPs who are snowflakes. I think if you go into Parliament and you are making important life and death decisions about potentially military action, decisions about the economy that can really impact on people's lives, then frankly you need a thick skin. And I want the debate in Parliament to be robust. I want people to be free to criticise and to attack and to mock if necessary. That's part of what a free Parliament should be about. And I do worry slightly that over recent years we've seen Parliament become almost a bit like a therapy workshop for some MPs, where you see these speeches where they unload their personal problems.
Absolutely.
And I'm uncomfortable with some of that, because all of us, you know, most people in the country have got personal problems to some degree or another and don't necessarily feel that they should spill those out in work. But equally, I think when it comes to things like physical intimidation, when it comes to things like sexual assault, then of course that stuff is completely out of bounds, and anybody who's guilty of it doesn't belong there. And we saw recently, I mean, the number of MPs who are under some sort of investigation because of allegations of sexual harassment. That was quite disturbing. It seems to me to be entirely disproportionate to most other workplaces and most other walks of life. So you do wonder if, when these people get into Parliament, they do think suddenly they're untouchable. You know, they're infused with this feeling that I'm all powerful now and I can treat people how I like. Well, they can't, and they need to understand that.
Yeah, because I think some people have a feeling that this is like the end of the major years, you know, where the Tories were in sleaze and all the rest of it. But of course, it's not just the Tories that have been involved in this sort of behaviour. Patrick Grady from the SNP, of course, was suspended very recently for sexual assault as well. So There is a need, is there not, not to fall into a moral panic about this. But you're so right about self-control, having responsibility for your actions. And if you step over that line, then you shouldn't be a Member of Parliament.
Yeah, and it's as you said, Arlene, it's not just a Tory thing.
No.
All political parties have had people in their ranks who have been guilty of this kind of thing. And, you know, I don't like it, frankly, when political parties seek to score points and to depict the other party as the one with all of the rotten apples and their own party is whiter than white. That's not the reality of it. You know, politicians need to be careful about going for the jugular on some of this stuff, because it will inevitably come back to haunt them.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you said, no place in Parliament for people who step over the line, physically or sexually try to intimidate other people. You know, the Parliament is full of young staffers and researchers and assistants, often, you know, in their first job sometimes or second job, making their way in life. And some of these people may be people who have got designs to become politically active, even MPs themselves. And if their first impression of Parliament is that actually it's a nest of vipers and they're not safe there, then they'll be put off. So that I think needs to be highlighted.
No, I think that's right. Anyway, on Thursday, our political correspondent Tom Harwood sat down for a national exclusive with Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg. They look at the government's response to inflation, the cost of living crisis and the other major issues affecting the UK. Let's take a listen.
This is interesting because it's not something that many of your colleagues in the Cabinet have articulated in terms of how to deal with the causes of inflation. We hear so much about how the government is dealing with the consequences of inflation, but when it comes to those causes, the government hasn't really been saying that it does want fiscal tightening.
It is fundamental to understand the causes, because bear in mind, inflation hits the least well-off in society the hardest. It hits the elderly on fixed incomes, and it hits the young who are just starting on their careers, who don't have a rapidly growing income. And this is really important, that we tackle the causes of inflation. And this is doing things that are difficult to do. I mean, increasing interest rates is hard for people. Tightening fiscal policy is hard for people. Therefore, we need to go further and faster with supply-side reforms, because that's the one thing that ameliorates the otherwise tightening situation. But the Governor Bank of England was setting out, I think yesterday, how difficult he sees the economy being. And this is a global problem, that there is a global inflation. It comes from globally loose money policy going back to 2008, and it comes from interruptions in supply chains from COVID. These, I think, the primary drivers. And then, of course, Ukraine on top of that. And I think we need to set out how difficult it is and then what we're doing to solve it, so that people understand the decisions that are going to be made, and of course can help in terms of retained EU law by saying, actually, if you do this, that makes life easier, that makes life more prosperous.
So a really interesting three-pronged approach there. Monetary tightening, fiscal tightening, and supply-side reforms. And those supply-side reforms, which are more your purview than the other two areas, have come under some criticism. Some people say that a lot of these regulations that you point to are trivial, that they don't really add up to all that much. What's your response to that criticism?
1,000 trivial things make something quite substantial. But that's the point, that what the EU did was it strangled enterprise by thousands of pettifogging regulations, each one in and of itself minor, but cumulatively leading to a decline in economic growth and the prospects for economic growth.
So that was Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Brexit Opportunities Minister, telling us about what he thinks needs to be done, and particularly in his role as Brexit Opportunities Minister. Paul, I don't think we've seen too much of Jacob Rees-Mogg recently, but he's coming along now and saying we need to deal with supply chain reforms. Is he really saying that we need to get rid of these regulations, which we said would go after Brexit?
Possibly, but my concern in terms of what he said about fiscal tightening and monetary
I thought you might pick him up on that one.
You won't be surprised, is that the danger is you just tip the economy into recession. I mean, the truth is that the inflation we're experiencing at the moment is not being driven by demand in terms of, you know, wage demands, etc. It's being driven by opening up the economy after the pandemic, some of the supply chain issues, the war in Ukraine, the increased cost of energy and so on. So fiscal and monetary tightening in that situation doesn't seem to me to be an answer, and actually could be counterproductive in terms of, as I say, creating a recession. And what happens then? We whack interest rates up further potentially in order to in an attempt, a misguided one in my view, to try to hold down inflation. What does that mean then for levels of employment? What does it mean for growth? What does it mean for prosperity? I mean, the priority, I have to say, and I would say this as somebody on the left, but the priority for me, you need to get real wages rising. You need to get growth into the economy. There are people who are struggling to make ends meet and have been doing so for many, many years now as a result of the global financial crisis, as a result now of the cost of living crisis. You need to get money into people's pockets. And if you don't do that, the danger is you end up in a recession and in that downward spiral.
But to push back against that, obviously, inflation does hit the least well off and elderly people on fixed incomes, as he said there. And to tackle that, you have to take tough decisions now so that you can get the economy back on track. And that's what he's talking about, taking those tough decisions, which will be unpopular, let's be honest about it, in the here and now. But if you think back to the 1980s, tough decisions were taken and then the economy grew and then there were more jobs.
I mean, I've got no issue with taking tough decisions, but I think they need to be the right decisions. That's the key point. And if you take a decision that's wrong, then whether or not you were brave in taking it, because it was a tough decision, doesn't really seem to me to be the answer. The answer, as I said, is to, we need to make our economy more competitive. We need to get investment up. We need to get productivity up. We need to get real wages rising. Look, I'm not naive enough to say there doesn't come a point if there is inflation as a result of demand, then you have to address that. Sometimes it's necessary to increase interest rates, for example. Sometimes it's necessary to increase taxes to stop the economy from overheating. But it strikes me that taking some of those measures at the moment, when inflation isn't caused by wages, and actually when we're on the brink of a recession anyway, seems to me to be the worst thing that we can do.
Well, sticking with fiscal matters, a handful of wealthy individuals are calling on the world leaders to tackle the cost of living crisis by pushing up taxes for people like them. Speaking during a protest at the World Economic Forum in May, UK millionaire Dr. Phil White said it's outrageous that political leaders listen to those who have the most but know the least about the economic impact of this crisis. Well, we're delighted to say that Dr. Phil joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Phil. What made you want to get involved with Patriotic Millionaires?
OK, good morning. Really, it was a sense that actually things weren't right and we were hitting working people and the low paid with a lot of tax increases, a lot of pressure on their incomes, if you like, that wasn't justified when I and a number of other people who are actually relatively wealthy and have high incomes could afford to pay more. So it was that injustice, as we saw it, in the sense of fairness, that I wanted to do something about at the end of the day.
And how do you see the organisation intervening in that? How has it helped thus far, do you think, Phil?
Well, I think it's raised the profile of this issue, and this is a big and important thing. And the protest in Davos was a way of getting attention, getting media attention, and making the point to, again, those in positions of power, either because more because they've got a lot of money, and with money comes influence and power. And also into the media and so on. So, yeah, absolutely, it's an awareness-raising thing. And since then, we've actually had a lot of interest in this and a lot of support for the cause.
Phil, I have to say it's quite refreshing to hear wealthy people arguing in favour of paying more tax. You usually hear the opposite. I wonder how many of you are there at the moment? How many within your group are you growing? Are you growing in influence and numbers?
Absolutely. I mean, the Patriotic Millionaires has existed in the United States for a long time, and with various well-known names like Abigail Disney and so on it. We're newer in the UK. We've only got about 10 or 20 members at the minute, but again, there are some very well-known names in there, and we are growing, yes, and we're also looking to grow more across the world, if you like, and actually create this influence. So we're getting a lot of support, and we're not getting a lot of people shouting us down, if you like, which is great.
So, Phil, obviously you felt very personally that you needed to get involved in this organisation and to raise your voice. Just tell our viewers and listeners how you made all of that lovely money that you now have.
Sure. I mean, I worked for my money. My parents were in engineering during the war and so on. I was brought up, I started off in technology research and development, then moved to a consulting company. And through the bonus structure and building up a share of that company, when we sold the company off, I made significant wealth. And I'm now very comfortable. I don't frankly need all that wealth. I'm very happy to share it. But again, with Patriotic Millionaires, we need more people to actually do that. And that's why we're calling on a change to the tax system, rather than, if you like, just giving the money away to charity. Because if 1 or 2 millionaires give money to charity, that's one thing, and it has a short-term effect. But actually, if we all do it through the tax system, then that's a very different thing altogether. And we look at raising tens of billions of pounds or more through actually a relatively small tax on wealth.
Well, that's actually the final question I was going to ask you. I mean, why do you need government to intervene? Why can you not give away the money yourself? But I think that you're clear that that's a good thing to do if you want to do that to charities, but you would rather see government get involved directly. Is that your point?
Absolutely. I mean, I work with various charities. I give money to charities, good causes. And, we all see homeless people in the street and we give them money and so on to support them. But yeah, the real power is not when, a few wealthy individuals give £1 million or £2 million or whatever to a charity or to a good cause. The real power comes when, we put a relatively low rate of tax, and we're talking about a couple of percent above 3.5 million or something, put a relatively low rate of tax across all the 1% of people who fall into that bracket, and we look at raising tens of billions of pounds. And that way we can really make a difference to the economy, and we can ease the pressure on the low paid and the working people, and rebalance that tax system to a way that actually we think is a lot fairer. So yeah, come on, tax us. We're not going to go hungry.
Dr. Phil White, thank you so much for joining us, a representative of Patriotic Millionaires. Nearly got the words out there. But anyway, thanks for joining us. During the week, the co-creator of legendary sitcom Friends apologised because none of the show's main characters were black. Writer and producer Marta Kaufman said during an interview she's embarrassed she didn't know better 25 years ago, and she's decided to give a university £3.3 million of her own money to fund a new professorship in African and African-American studies. Paul, what do you make of all of this?
Well, it's another example of, self-flagellation, isn't it? and look, of course, in the past, we didn't necessarily get things right in terms of the media and representation of minority groups. But you learn from that and you move forward. But this spectacle of people constantly thinking they have to don sackcloth and ashes and go in for some kind of penance, I think is just tedious, to be honest, and it is now bordering on virtue signalling. And I just wonder as well, Arlene, actually, I think in some respects at the moment we're probably oversteering because, of course, regardless of your background, regardless of your colour and your religion, there should be no barriers on you in terms of rising to the top of your chosen career, in terms of getting on in the media or entertainment and so on. But it seems to me now that if you watch television dramas and adverts and so on, that we're almost now over-representing certain minority groups because we are so desperate to prove our credentials on this point. I use the example of the series about the Larkins based on the Darling Buds of May, which was set in 1950s in rural Kent. And was on ITV last year. It could have been set in Islington in 2021. And in the end, I think it just becomes a bit of a moral lecture and people feel that they're just being patronised. So the focus for me should always be challenge any barriers that prevent people from aspiring to the top of their profession, but don't patronise and don't morally lecture. And I think with the Friends example, that's the kind of territory we're getting into at the moment.
But it's also the hindsight issue. Here's a lady who wrote a very funny, I enjoyed it, Friends sitcom 25 years ago. And now she's going, oh, I should have known better 25 years ago. I should have had somebody in from an ethnic, diverse background. I mean, when you write something and it's there and you sell it to the studio, now you have to say, oh, hold on a second, I should have put somebody in. I mean, to me, that's tokenism of the worst kind.
And I think there's a real danger, and I think we do it all the time in this country, where we apply yesterday's standards to the modern age.
Yeah.
Now, once you get into that game, you are on a very, very slippery slope, because the truth is that social mores and cultural norms change all of the time.
Yeah.
And there will be things that we say and we do now, which in 20 years people will find incredible that we say and we did, and will say, well, that was clearly offensive. Now, we don't necessarily know that now because we don't know what the social mores and cultural norms are going to be in 20 years.
It's the hindsight piece. And we'll not get into the 1970s comedy routine as well because we could be in very difficult ground there. But coming up, we'll go into the second hour of the political correction. But keep those views coming in. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. See you shortly.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things could have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Sorry, too busy reading your views. Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up on the political correction, assisted dying. Should terminally ill people be able to choose to end their lives? We'll hear from both sides of the debate. Nicola Sturgeon this week announced a date for a second referendum on Scottish independence. But can it actually go ahead? We'll speak to an SNP activist about all of that. And our very own Alistair Stewart tells us what's coming up on his show. That plus plenty more after your latest news with Ray.
Good morning. It's just after 11 a.m. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Several new allegations of inappropriate behaviour have been made against former Conservative MP Chris Pincher. 6 claims have emerged just days after he resigned as Deputy Whip and was suspended from the party after allegedly groping 2 men. The latest allegations, which stretch back more than a decade, were reported in several newspapers this morning, claiming he made unwanted advances to male MPs. No official complaints were ever made, and he's denied the allegations to newspapers. Mr Pincher says he's currently seeking professional medical support, but insists he will remain as an MP. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor have outlined what they're calling the single biggest tax cut in a decade. Writing a joint article in The Sun on Sunday, they say Wednesday's increase in the national insurance threshold will save millions of British workers up to £330 a year. The government also plans to provide relief for council tax bills, fuel duty and energy costs. Economist Vicky Price told GB News the NI cut won't make that big a difference.
Indeed, I think the discussion which is going on right now is what to do with VAT in particular. Yes, the Chancellor is saying that, and the Prime Minister, that we're cutting taxes because we're increasing the threshold for national insurance contributions for when you start paying them. But in reality, those national insurance contributions have gone up. So they've given back something, but they're taking away a lot more overall. So it's not necessarily a tax cut as such when you look at the overall context.
The government wants security checks on new airport workers to be treated as a priority to prevent travel delays this summer. The Department of Transport claim counter-terrorist checks are being processed in record times as shortages of baggage and security staff fuel hold-ups. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says people have made huge sacrifices during the pandemic and deserve their flights to run on time. Travel expert Simon Calder told GB News there are some serious delays.
And there's a huge blame game going on with the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, saying to the airlines, you spent 2 years saying all you want to do is fly people around and to the airports as well. You just want people to be able to travel as soon as they can. It all falls apart. But they say, look, actually, we suffered the most serious travel restrictions of any European country.
The government's spending watchdog plans to investigate the Prime Minister's 2019 election pledge to build 40 new hospitals by the end of the decade. It's after the Shadow Health Secretary warned the plans are a waste of taxpayers' money, with many hospitals having alterations or refurbishments instead of actually being new. Wes Streeting has also criticised delays, with NHS trusts still waiting for funds to be allocated. Russia says at least 3 people have been killed and 4 injured in the Russian city of Belgorod near the Ukraine border. The area's regional governor says at least 11 apartment buildings and 39 homes were damaged, with 5 destroyed. However, the reports are yet to be independently verified. Meanwhile, President Zelensky says Russia's attack continues to focus on the Donbas region.
There is a sense of relaxation in many rear cities now, but the war is not over. It is there. Unfortunately, its brutality sometimes only grows, and we must not forget about it. Brutal hostilities continue along the entire front line. In Donbas, the epicenter, of course, in the cities of Luhansk region. Hostile activity is intensifying in the Kharkiv region.
Cyberbullying may be playing a key role in keeping mortality rates high among people with asthma. A study from Nottingham University Business School says online abuse fuels a vicious cycle, meaning those with the condition can trivialise it and be less likely to take their medication. Thousands of Australians have been ordered to evacuate parts of Sydney after torrential rain brought intense flooding. Vehicles have been left marooned and sports fields turned into lakes, with the Met Office warning the downpour will intensify over the next 2 days. Wimbledon will have tennis on the middle Sunday of the tournament for the first time in its history. British players Heather Watson and Cameron Norrie will both be in action, making their debuts in the last 16. The centenary of Centre Court is also being celebrated at the All England Club, with previous winners making an appearance alongside refugees from Ukraine, Syria and Afghanistan. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Thanks to Ray, and good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News, and this is the political correction. We're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. So what's coming up this hour? Well, we'll debate whether terminally ill people should have the right to end their lives, with campaigners both for and against the idea. Nicola Sturgeon this week has set a date for a second referendum on Scottish independence for October 2023. But many say the move could be illegal. We'll speak to a former SNP councillor about the First Minister's announcement. And a report claims around 100,000 school children have been absent from classrooms since the pandemic. Should we have ever closed our schools? And lots of you have been getting in touch today, but keep them coming. If you want to get involved in the conversation, email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. So as I was caught out at the beginning of the hour, we have been getting lots and lots of views today. Paul, what has taken your eye today?
On the Pincher scandal, Sue says, why did these men not sort Pincher out at the time? When I was a union rep in the 1980s, fending off men was almost a full-time job in itself. However, I needed no one to help me dish it out. I did it on my own. If someone is behaving in a way you don't like, sort them out there and then. Spoken like a true union.
A strong lady, I suspect. A strong lady, indeed. And Maggie says on the Pincher issue, Chris Pincher should be made to resign. Lord Frost could then be given the opportunity to stand in his place, a Brexiteer to step into Boris Johnson's premiership. So a lot of people watching, having their comments on that issue in Parliament, but also on babies in Parliament. Martin says, an MP who thinks it's OK to take a baby to work in the House of Commons is not in touch with the real world, just saying. And David says, isn't there enough childish behaviour in the House of Commons without babies? Possibly. Paul, anything else?
Yeah, we've got a couple on inflation and ReesMogg's interview with our own Tom Harwood. Kenny says that this governor of the Bank of England should be sacked because he did not raise interest rates fast enough to combat inflation. And Linda says, please can we get rid of the man in charge of the Bank of England? The UK does not need another doomsayer knocking the UK. Is he another Ramona?
And then finally, Hal says, Paul is absolutely spot on as usual with all things from Ukraine, Russia, Halifax pronouns, excellent common sense. You have to run for Parliament, Paul. Well, we've heard that before.
They wouldn't have me, Arlene.
We've heard that before. Anyhow, moving on to a serious issue now. Tomorrow, MPs will hold a Westminster Hall debate over the long-running and contentious issue of whether terminally ill people should have the right to end their lives. The topic of assisted dying has been a divisive one, with many saying the state should not prevent individuals from ending their own suffering, and those who believe it would give too much power to the state and violate the sanctity of life. Well, ahead of Monday's debate, we're joined this morning by advocates from both sides of the divide, David Pearce from Campaign for Dignity in Dying, and Dr Callum Miller, a research associate at the University of Oxford and a pro-life campaigner. David, I'm going to come to you first. Why do you think that this rules around assisted dying need to be changed?
I mean, primarily because the current law which bans assisted dying is forcing dying people to suffer against their wishes. Research shows that 17 people a day will suffer as they die, and that's despite the very best care. So when MPs debate this tomorrow, I hope that they look at that kind of evidence, but also think what happens next after this debate. And I would ask Parliament to issue some sort of inquiry or perhaps get a select committee to look at the evidence, pull it all together and to really provide some proper scrutiny, because I don't think Parliament has had enough time to look at this issue in full. And when it does, it will see that the law is in urgent need of reform because it is causing dying people to suffer through the lack of choice.
So, Callum, what's your response to what you've just heard there from David?
Well, obviously, I think all of us can understand the difficulties involved in these often horrendous situations. I work as a medical doctor as well. I was in Canada just last week, where they have what we would generally call assisted suicide, because, of course, we already assist people in dying through palliative care. What this debate is fundamentally about is whether we can help people to commit suicide. Now, normally when we have someone who is suicidal in my job in medicine, we do our very best to help them. And in almost every case, we can help them and end that suffering without ending their life. What has actually been shown in places like Oregon and Canada, Belgium and Holland is that when you relax the rules on doctors helping patients to commit suicide, all hell breaks loose. We know that thousands of people have been euthanized or killed without their consent as a result of these laws in places like Holland. We know that there's a huge increase in people committing suicide legally in Oregon, partly because of financial reasons, because they couldn't get palliative care, or for other reasons like feeling they're a burden to their family. And so I think we really need to make absolutely sure that we have the right care possible of preventing suffering in the first place before we start offering doctors a way to end their patients' lives themselves.
And I suppose, David, that is a concern, that risk of people feeling like a burden and feeling like they should leave this life because of their families perhaps having to look after them. I mean, how do you answer those sorts of concerns?
I think it's important that we do answer those concerns, and I hope a parliamentary inquiry could make a step forward in doing so.
I think we need to be alive to the issue of what the current law is doing now. And the current law here is inherently unsafe because it is forcing dying people to feel they can't have these open discussions with a doctor about something that's illegal, and it just pushes it behind closed doors. And I can give you an example. There was a man called Charles who was dying from cancer, and his daughter Zoe was looking after him. She arranged for some neighbours to stop in and see how he was. And imagine this, you go around to check on your 80-year-old neighbour who's dying of cancer, and you find a note pinned to his front door which says, "Don't come in, I've killed myself, I'm in the garage, call the police." And this is what happened, and the neighbours sadly ignored that note. They went into the garage and they found poor Charles hanging from the end of a rope. Now, I don't see how anyone can say the current law is acceptable when it's forcing people into lonely suicides happening in secret and behind closed doors. We need to bring everything out into the open because the current law is unsafe.
And Callum, how do you answer that distressing example that David has given? Because, of course, there are those who are coming to the end of their life in incredible pain and they just want it all to end.
Well, I think what we need to be doing is what the government is doing, which is increasing the palliative care available so that these situations don't happen. All of us are appalled at these sorts of situations and appalled at the thought of suicide, and we all think there should be better support to stop that happening. The question is how best to stop that happening as much as possible. Now, when you actually look at the statistics, when assisted suicide is legalized, there is actually an increase in suicides, including suicides out of the medical system. So it just doesn't seem like legalizing assisted suicide is the solution to these kinds of problems. It actually increases the problems, increases the number of suicides. So there's been a call for example, a committee to look at the evidence, but the government has looked at the evidence time and time again. They found that 90% of palliative care doctors in this country oppose assisted suicide. They have found that there has been huge pressure in other countries like the Netherlands for vulnerable people to take their own lives when the law has been liberalized. And so ultimately, this law is protecting vulnerable people and trying to give them the best support, rather than putting them in a position where they have their lives ended without their consent, which is what happens in thousands and thousands of cases in the Netherlands. And so, of course, we agree that suicide is a huge problem. Of course, it needs to be solved and we need to do better. The question is, how do we do better? And my experience as a medical doctor, as a researcher, and the experience of the large majority of palliative care doctors, 90% of them, is that legalizing assisted suicide only makes that problem far, far worse.
So, David, finally then, is that not the answer? Should we not be investing more in palliative care, being a more compassionate society, by getting alongside those who are suffering from some terrible diseases? Is that not the answer as opposed to assisted dying?
I don't think it's a binary question. We need both. I welcome the government's commitment to ensuring better quality end-of-life care. And I look forward to that being rolled out nationwide. But it doesn't solve the problem of the 17 people a day who will suffer as they die, even if they have access to that care. It doesn't solve the problems with the current law, which actually criminalises compassion. I can give an example of that. Mavis Eccleston and her husband Dennis was dying of cancer. He took matters into his own hands, but he did have some assistance from Mavis. So shortly after he died, holding Mavis's hand, she was taken from the hospital in a nightgown and slippers to a police station and arrested for murder. Then the family were put through the trauma of an 18-month trial, only for Mavis to be found unanimously not guilty. And the CPS have said this could happen again because it's the way the law is constructed. So the law is actually criminalising acts of compassion and driving a wedge in a loving family where someone's been married for 50 years. And there is absolutely no question that Mavis was acting out of compassion, but still, under the law, she has to be treated like a criminal, and that is wrong.
Well, David and Callum, thank you so much for having a respectful debate here on the political correction this morning. No doubt we'll return to this issue very soon. It's good to have an open and honest discussion. Thank you so much. So this week, Nicola Sturgeon announced her intention to hold a second referendum on Scottish independence. The First Minister said that the referendum would be consultative, meaning the outcome of the vote could not be implemented unless it gained approval from the UK Supreme Court. But critics have said that a second referendum may in fact be illegal. So can this vote even go ahead? And if so, would the result actually mean anything? I'm delighted to say that joining us now to discuss this is SNP member and former Glasgow City Councillor Austin Sheridan. Austin, thanks for joining us on the show today. I presume that you're very supportive of this move by the First Minister. Tell us why.
Well, I'm supportive of it because there is a mandate for a second referendum in the Scottish parliamentary elections last year. The Scottish Parliament elected the largest pro-independence majority parliament since its establishment in 1999. I think it's important as Democrats that we respect that. If it were the other way around and it was a majority of unionists MSPs that were elected to Holyrood, as a Democrat, I would have to accept that, and I would have to accept that there wasn't going to be another referendum. So I think that is Democrats first and foremost. We have to respect that mandate, and that's why I'm pleased that the First Minister has put a pathway forward to how we in Scotland are going to decide our own future. You know, putting the power back to the people.
Well, I mean, I think by that you're suggesting that the only reason people vote for the SNP is on Scottish independence, and do they not vote for other reasons?
I'm sure they do vote for other reasons, but at the end of the day, we can't cherry pick what parts of manifestos people voted for and which parts they didn't. I mean, Arlene is leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. It may be potential that people didn't always vote for you because they believed in the Union, which, to be fair, I would find hard to believe because politics in the north of Ireland is so polarised. Maybe the other way around, that maybe people voted for you for the Union but didn't support maybe your views on things like equal marriage or abortion, but people still voted for those things, and you still always stood on the principles that you stood for election for, which, to be fair, if people gave you the vote, then you have the right to take forward that mandate. And all we are saying is that we should be able to take forward our mandate.
Well, it's Northern Ireland, actually, not the north of Ireland, but I think, Paul, you have a question as well.
Austin, isn't the truth? Look, if you have your second referendum and you lose it, the SNP are just going to keep campaigning again and again and again for another referendum. It becomes a never-endum, doesn't it? And you know, the truth is, when we had the referendum in 2014, the SNP said this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Well, it clearly wasn't, because they keep banging the drum for another referendum. You're just not going to give up, be honest.
Well, a line from one politician can't hold the whole future of a nation hostage. You know, at the end of the day, it is up to the people. And it's important that there's a democratic route for people to decide the future of their own country. I mean, as Alan will know, as I say, in Ireland, there's been major issues across the whole island about democracy and how people can implement their will. There's now international agreements in place under the Good Friday Belfast Agreement to ensure that there's democratic means for people to decide the constitutional future of that part of the world. If that route wasn't there, because it was about ensuring that if there was going to be change, there was a democratic route, then we may not be in the position where violence has ended today. So why should Scotland be denied a democratic route to decide the future? And even in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, I believe, and Alan can correct me if I'm wrong here, that a border poll can only be held 7 years after the last one would have been, and that time would have elapsed under Scotland's case. It would be 9 years since the last referendum.
Well, I think the Belfast Agreement is very clear that a border poll can only be held when there is sufficient indications that there's a possibility that it might be successful. And let's face it, there's no justification for this referendum, is there? Because it was your own First Minister that said it was a generational referendum. And also, every poll still shows in Scotland that people favour the Union.
Well, I believe that Boris Johnson in 2019 said that general election was a generational opportunity. I don't think anyone is expecting no more general elections. I also believe that Boris Johnson said that he would die in a ditch if Brexit wasn't delivered, and then the date passed. I don't think anybody expected him to die in a ditch, and I certainly didn't either. But the point is that politicians will make statements to emphasise the importance of decisions that we have ahead of us. They're not necessarily meant to be taken on a literal basis. But the key point is that we need to have a democratic route. Nicola Sturgeon set out 3 options, and all these options are things that have been used in the past. I mean, in 1986, when you were a teenager, Arlene, I believe that all the unionist MPs in the North resigned in order to have by-elections to have a say over the Anglo-Irish agreement. So these are all things that have already been tested as ways and means of gauging public opinion, because people should have the say.
Well, Alistair, it's been really good to have you on the show today, and thank you for reminding me of my political youth back in 1986. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much, Arlene.
Thanks. So coming up next, our own legendary broadcaster, Alistair Stewart, joins us to discuss what to expect from him at midday. And keep those views coming in. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at GBNews.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. And coming up at midday is our very own broadcasting legend, Alistair Stewart. And we're delighted to say that he's joined Paul and I in the studio now to look ahead to his show at 12. So what's on, Alistair, today?
Well, we were going to talk about the cost of living crisis anyway. And lo and behold, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, have taken a 2-page spread in the Sun newspaper pledging their absolute best possible efforts to help all of us through this real cost of living crisis, with inflation still going up, no sign of energy prices coming down and the rest of it. And basically what they've done in their article is list what they've already done. The spring package of help with people with their bills. And the only hint at what might come in the future will be help for business taxes. So for Joe and Joanna Public, it's really no great deal. So we're going to carry on with what we're going to do, but that's going to slightly set
It's
the
an
tone.
indication, though, is it not, that they know that this is a big issue?
I think that is true, but then October is the next crucial period, because that's when that money starts kicking in.
Yeah.
And you know better than anybody else that there's the proper autumn budget then, and he may be able to do more. But
And the energy cap is going up in October again.
That will also
so
be
that's
reviewed
another
again.
pressure
And
point.
as I say, energy prices doing that thing. But it just struck me journalistically to be slightly odd. And I was chatting to Nigel Nelson out there from the People and the Mirror, who we agreed it's odd to, as Prime Minister and Chancellor Exchequer, take a 2-page spread in the most read newspaper in the country and say virtually nothing fresh, other than say, yeah, we know you've got a problem. It may be a wasted opportunity. Or it could be that the problems are insurmountable. So we're talking to Sir John Redwood, who's one of the people who definitely wants VAT cut, particularly on energy prices. We're talking to Kevin Holrake, who you know well as member of the Treasury Select Committee, the watchdog for the Treasury in the House of Commons. We've also got Julian Jessup, who used to work in the Treasury and knows how these problems are resolved. Because if you cut any taxes, you've either got to cut some other form of spending or you've got to increase borrowing. And that is astronomical as well. So I'm hoping it'll be quite a lively debate, and hopefully it may even yield some answers that will make life a bit better. We've got Jasmine Birtles on as well from Magpie Money, great friend of GBNews and of our programme, who will have absolutely spot-on little tips to help people get through the summer holidays, particularly if their young ones have joined them after school and they, might not be able to afford to go to Spain, but they can still go to beautiful parts of our country and maybe have a picnic rather than go to a restaurant. Stuff like that, I think, we'll be talking about. And we've got a real treat from the British Grand Prix. Now, we talked about it. And do I keep it as a surprise or do I not? Suffice to say, he and I also are great fans of the Rolling Stones. He's quite a good musician in his own right. And he began his career after school and college at the Bank of Ireland. It is the great Eddie Jordan.
I'm glad you said it, because I thought we were going to be teased all the way along there. But anyway, you've
I think it's one of those calls where I don't want people to think it's Lewis Hamilton, who everybody out there knows is my great God, much as I would love to talk to him. I think he'll be a little bit busy. He'll be a wee bit preoccupied, but I think Eddie will be good, because there's also, on the serious tone, there's the Nelson Piquet's outburst about Lewis Hamilton using the N-word. There's Eddie. There's also Bernie Ecclestone saying, "I'd take a bullet for Putin."
I know.
So Eddie is someone I know very well and is up for that stuff, as well as the actual motorsport.
Gosh, it sounds like a fascinating...
I hope it'll be good. I'll be going all the way through. And then your producer is off to see the Rolling Stones this evening.
Yeah, it's only second best you actually been at Silverstone, of course.
I have been to Silverstone. I've been a couple of times. And it's one of those weird things. It's a bit like pop concerts. To be honest, you get spoiled. If somebody looks after you really well, and you get put in the paddock and you get to...
You're making us all jealous.
Well, it's true. And one of my favourite pictures, we went to the Bahrain Grand Prix and I took my daughter Clemmy, and there's a picture of her standing outside the McLaren garage when Lewis used to drive for McLaren before Mercedes. And Lewis is just in the background and he waved to her. So that's one of her
I went go-karting on Lowestoft seafront ones. It doesn't quite fall into the same category.
It does.
He started off go-karting, didn't he,
Lewis Hamilton began karting. Most of the greats began karting. Eddie Jordan was a karter himself. Never really made it as an F1 driver, but as a team principal and as an owner he did. And he employed the greats like Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, Damon Hill, all sorts of people. And that's one of the reasons I really like Eddie, is that he's not just one of these rich fat cats who flies in, buys a team, and then sits back and watches the money burn away. He's actually earned his points and knows the trade very well indeed. He's just a great talker as well as Eddie.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating show, and we wish you well with it.
You're both very kind, thank you.
But coming up on the Political Correction, we will have our regular Common Ground feature with our very own Calvin Robinson, and we'll discuss a report that claims around 100,000 school pupils have been absent from classrooms since the pandemic, raising the question, should we ever have closed our schools? All this and more, but first, here's your latest news with Ray Addison.
Thanks. Just after 11:30, here's the latest from the GB Newsroom. Several new allegations of inappropriate behaviour have been made against former Conservative MP Chris Pincher. 6 claims have emerged just days after he resigned as Deputy Whip and was suspended from the party after allegedly groping 2 men. The latest allegations, which stretch back more than a decade, were reported in several newspapers this morning. They claim he made unwanted advances to male MPs. No official complaints were ever made, and he's denied the allegations to newspapers. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor have outlined what they're calling the single biggest tax cut in a decade. Writing a joint article in The Sun on Sunday, they say Wednesday's increase in the national insurance threshold will save millions of British workers up to £330 a year. The government also plans to provide relief for council tax bills, fuel duty and energy costs. The government wants security checks on new airport workers to be treated as a priority to prevent travel delays this summer. The Department of Transport claim counter-terrorist checks are being processed in record times as shortages of baggage and security staff fuel hold-ups. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says people have made huge sacrifices during the pandemic and deserve their flights to run on time. And Wimbledon will have tennis on the middle Sunday of the tournament for the first time in its history. British players Heather Watson, Cameron Norrie will both be in action, making their debuts in the last 16. The centenary of Centre Court is also being celebrated at the All England Club, with previous winners making an appearance. We're on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. This, of course, is GB News. Now back to the political correction in just a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Welcome back to the show, and we've had quite a response to the show today, including on assisted dying. Paul, do you want to raise some of those issues?
Yeah, my namesake Paul says on assisted dying, I'm totally against relaxing the rules on this. Pressure from unscrupulous families and misguided medical personnel could lead to unnecessary deaths. And Janice says, surely this should be allowed as bodily autonomy.
Yeah, and Ben says this is a contentious subject. In my opinion, no government or official body should have the right to tell you that you cannot end your life if you have no standard of living. I know there is a huge chance the end of my life will be very nasty and not something anyone should have to suffer if they can avoid it. Also, we have to consider all those who attempt to end their life and just end up making their quality of life worse. Professional help to end life is true compassion. I think it's a very divisive issue, Paul, but one I think that we need to talk about. So I'm glad we were able to do that today. And then there's some comments on the SNP, Paul.
Yeah, you'll love this one, Arlene. Michael says it was great to hear Arlene correct the Republican Scot. It's Northern Ireland. I believe it should be renamed West Britain to put an end to Republican ideas.
And Joan says, Joan's from Scotland, and Joan says the SNP makes you ashamed to be Scottish. which I am. So we've got quite a response to that as well. So keep your views coming in. We love to hear from you every Sunday morning. But Sunday is a special day for Christians, but we do acknowledge, of course, that faith comes in all shapes and sizes. And each week on The Political Correction, we aim to talk to someone at the heart of his or her community to talk about what brings us together. In other words, our common ground. Yesterday, I sat down with GB News' own Calvin Robinson, who last week was ordained as an Anglican deacon after a series of setbacks from the Church of England. Here's what Calvin had to say about his special day.
It was an absolute privilege. It really was. I couldn't have asked for a better service. But after months and years of tribulation, it finally happened. And it just showed me that, it doesn't matter who you are. If God is calling you to something, it will happen, regardless of whatever hurdles people try to put in your way.
And you were a teacher, Calvin, before you were called. And when did you receive the call? How long ago was that?
Yeah, so I think actually teaching was the start of my priestly vocation, because I was in industry for a while before that, very superficial lifestyle, making money and all of this, having fun, but it wasn't fulfilling and it wasn't rewarding. And I sensed a call around the time I shifted into teaching when I was looking for something else and I didn't know what I was looking for. And it took me a long time to work out, actually, I was looking for Christ. And not just was I looking for Christ, I was looking to serve Christ. And after a few years in teaching, I realized that I was doing the teaching, I was doing the pastoral stuff, but I wasn't doing the sacramental administration. And that was what was missing. So I went off to my local priest, joined some vocation groups, and eventually got sent to Oxford to read theology with a plan of being ordained in the Church of England. But that plan did not go as straightforward as I thought it would.
And for our listeners and viewers who don't know the story, Calvin, just tell us briefly what happened or didn't happen, as the case was.
Yeah, so I've obviously got a little bit of a media profile, as in people know where I stand on political issues because I talk about them in the media. However, so going into this training process as a trainee priest, as an ordinand, people knew what my opinions were and knew that I tried to at least put my faith at the forefront of all of my politics. However, at some point during the end of the process, as I was supposed to be sent off into a parish as a curate or an assistant priest to kind of learn the ropes on the job, it became clear that the bishops were not happy to send me back to London and weren't happy to ordain me, even after confirming my calling and saying that the church also saw that I was called to ministry. For some reason, and they were never very explicit, they didn't want to send me back to London. And so I put in a subject access request and found out that actually all along, from before they even sent me to Oxford, this whole time, the bishops have been talking behind my back about how conservative I was in my theology and in my politics, and how problematic that might be. There were emails from bishops, the Bishop of Edmonton, for example, said, Calvin does not believe this country is institutionally racist, therefore we should keep an eye on his ordination process, i.e. he's not one of us politically, we shouldn't really ordain him. I think it's terrible that, they're letting politics get in the way. Not once did they say, I didn't have enough faith. Not once did they say I'd be a poor servant of Christ. And not once did they say I'm a heretic or my theology is poor. It was always my politics. But to my face, they would smile and say, oh, no, your politics is fine. We're a diverse and inclusive church. But behind my back in the email chains, it was very clear that they did not want a person like me amongst their midst.
And for those of us of faith from the Anglican community, it is quite shocking to hear that, Calvin. And I'm sure you have received a lot of correspondence from very concerned members of the Anglican Church.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest eye-opener for me has been that, I've talked a lot about this, not because I'm bitter and resentful or not because I want an apology from the church, but just because I need to expose what's going on. And as I have done that, lots and lots of people from within the Anglican Church have reached out to say things like, this has happened to them, but they're not in a position, they don't have a platform to tell people about it. And or if they speak up about it, I've had priests get in touch, vicars get in touch and say, we can't say anything because if we do, our stipend will be removed, we'll be starved out. I've had ordinands get in touch and say, we're keeping our head down, they're shoving this black theology and queer theology down our throats, but we have to just get on with it. Otherwise, we won't make it through. And it's been so eye-opening because so many people across the board have reached out, but not just clergy, people, congregants, people in the pews have reached out to say, my vicar is more likely to preach about climate change than he is about Jesus Christ. It's a sorry state of affairs. What can we do? It feels to me like the Church of England has gone astray. But I'm here to say that it's okay, because as much as the church is leaving people behind, it is not the only expression of church, and Christ's church will win out in the end. And I've joined a community within the Anglican Communion called GAFCON, which is a global movement of people that want to affirm Orthodox Anglicanism. I've been ordained within the Free Church of England. In this country, there's the Free Church of England, there's AME, there's ACE. There are a few expressions within GAFCON. And in North America, it's doing very well in the ACNA and the Reformed Episcopal Church. So there are roots. If people do want to stick to Orthodox Anglicanism, some people don't want to go to Rome, some people don't want to go to non-denominational. There are ways of remaining Anglican and remaining faithful outside of the established church.
Well, thank you for that, Calvin. But you also wanted to talk to us today about education with your former background as a teacher. Tell us what you wanted to say.
Absolutely. It's a worrying time, education. We have a conservative government, and I use that in inverted commas, because under this government, we've seen relationship and sexual education be pushed through. And we've always had sex ed in our schools, but when I was a teacher, when I first started teaching, sex ed was something that happened in secondary schools, and I understood the reason behind it, although I wasn't fully in favor of it, because I think these are conversations that parents should be having with their children. Schools should be teaching 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. They should be teaching knowledge, and parents should pass on the other information, whether it's British values, Christian values, or relationship and sexual health and ethics and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, sex ed has been a thing for a while, but now the Conservative government has pushed through relationship and sexual education, which actually is a Trojan horse, because what it's done is it's taken sex ed from secondary school, pushed it down to primary school, and now we have kids as young as 5 years old being taught about masturbation. Now, I think that's entirely inappropriate. The reason behind it was they said, we need to teach kids about different types of families, such as homosexual families, or we need to teach them about different kinds of people, such as transsexual people. And you can see there is an argument to be had there, but for it to be pushed down into primary is entirely age inappropriate. We're breaking down this idea of a normative family as if having one father, one mother, and children is a bad thing. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other lifestyles and other ways of being family, but to suggest that a two-parent family of a mother and a father is a negative is totally disingenuous and dishonest and actually quite wicked. So we need to fight against that. But so the government's pushed forward RSE. It's also pushed forward this new schools bill, which hasn't fully gone through yet, so there's still time to fight it. But this bill will cancel out home education. So for people that think, actually, our schools have gone too woke, this RSE stuff is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much going on in schools. If parents knew what their kids were being taught. But homeschooling is being cancelled out because the government wants you to take your kids to a school. And I think there are good reasons behind that, but at the same time, again, it's a parent's responsibility to educate children. Schools are supplementary, schools are helpful, but the state should not replace the parent. So we've got RSE, we've got homeschooling being cancelled, and at the same time, free schools being cancelled, which was a fantastic Conservative policy. And the idea that parents and teachers can get together in an area where a school is needed and create one with their own ideology, with their own values, with their own set of curricula, and say, look, this is what we think needs to be taught. Now that's been taken away, and MATs are being encouraged, multi-academy trusts, big business. If you've already got 50 schools, you're great. You can set up another one just the same. More schools is usually a good thing, but I think parental choice is key. And if a group of Christians want to set up a school, fantastic. If a group of teachers want to set up a school, well, that should also be good and encouraged. I don't see why they're clamping down on these 3 areas. It's all very anti-conservative and very worrying.
So that was Common Ground with our very own Reverend Calvin Robinson. But a report from the Centre for Social Justice examining the impact of lockdowns on British schools has found that around 100,000 pupils across the UK have been absent from classrooms since the pandemic. The publication argues that schools are unlikely to have been able to effectively re-engage pupils after shutdowns, and that the Department of Education should appoint further attendance practitioners to address the underlying causes of school absence. But it does raise the question, should our schools have ever been closed at all? Paul, this really is one of the unseen harms of COVID, isn't it? The fact that there are so many children not in school.
It just seems to me, Arlene, to be an absolutely incredible story. 100,000 kids effectively absent from the school registers since the end of the pandemic. And one statistic we picked up on is that schools with the most disadvantaged intakes were 10 times as likely to have a class worth of severely absent pupils in autumn 2020 compared to schools with the most affluent intakes. So obviously there's a socio-economic factor there as well. And I think you do have to ask, you know, were we right in the way that we effectively locked down the whole of our society, including schools, for a virus that ultimately posed a threat to a small minority of people? Not that we shouldn't have had targeted protection for those individuals. I'm convinced we should have taken an approach like Sweden, where they were more relaxed. They didn't quarantine millions of healthy people, and as a result are not likely to suffer the kind of economic pain and other consequences that we're suffering in our country.
And I mean, frankly, it is the vulnerable children that are probably missing from our schools now. And schools always provided that early warning system if a kid was in trouble, that they could then pass that on. The fact that they're not in schools now is something that we should, as a society, be really very concerned about.
I think there are huge safeguarding issues there, as you say, vulnerable kids, and you know, God forbid we end up paying a price with the safety of some of those kids. I'm convinced, Arlene, that this will be a bit like the Iraq War, where in a few years' time you won't be able to find a single commentator who supported it at the time, because you then realise what the consequences are. And I think we're already starting to see a number of people backing away from the lockdown restrictions. In time, I think we'll regard some of them as completely over the top.
Or indeed the consequences of lockdown. I mean, we're seeing a lot of Labour MPs, for example, talking about inflation and talking about the economic consequences now as if it had nothing to do with the fact that they pushed for a harder lockdown.
Well, the bill was always going to land at some point, and it was almost like we tried to, we kidded ourselves that there wasn't going to be a consequence, there wasn't going to be an economic consequence of what we were doing. And now the bill is landing, not just economically, but in terms of people's health conditions, you know, undetected cancers and heart disease, where people were, let's say, encouraged not to go to hospital and put pressure on the National Health Service. All of those problems are now starting to build up, and I think they're going to last for a number of years to come.
But as you say, I mean, kids that aren't going to school are more likely to be excluded, more likely then to become involved in criminal activity, starting off at the very lowest level, but escalating. And that's a really bad situation for us to be in with our young people.
And, you know, where are these kids?
Yeah.
You know, you've got 100,000 kids who are absent from the register since the end of the pandemic. Where are they? What's happening to them? What education are they getting? You would hope that some of them are being homeschooled, but the very fact that we don't seem to know where so many of them are does raise all sorts of safety issues, and it's pretty clear to me that their education is going to be compromised. But the other factors that you talk about as well, you know, what are they going to be turning to? Are they going to be dabbling in drugs? Are they going to be turning to crime? What's their home life like at the moment? This is, I think, one of the most serious consequences of the lockdown, and we cannot gloss over it.
And because we don't know where they are, it's very difficult then for government to take action, is it not? I mean, how do we find these absent pupils? Because I know homeschooling has increased, so that some of the kids are possibly being homeschooled now, and families have decided, you know, we were able to school our children at home during the pandemic. We're going to continue to do that because we can actually inculcate our ethics and our beliefs in our kids rather than sending them to school. So there's a few, I would imagine, are being homeschooled, but I would imagine the majority aren't being homeschooled.
I'm pretty sure that must be the case. You just hope the state and local authorities have got the wherewithal, the resources to be able to find where these kids are. And actually, when you think, you know, the period of time since the restrictions were lifted, the fact that there are still so many of them, their whereabouts, we don't know where they are, we've been unable to identify them. There must be some real pressing safety concerns, and you hope the state and the local authority are onto it.
Well, it's a very concerning report, and no doubt we'll be following its progress through the House and finding out what's going to happen from the government. But now it's time for an update on the week's biggest stories from the world of sport. I'm delighted to say we're joined in the studio by sports commentator and broadcaster Aidan McGee. Well, there's lots going on, Aidan, out there, and I'm looking at the back of this paper saying, run his way.
Yeah, I mean, take your pick. We had a mammoth programme of Wimbledon matches last night, going into today as well. We had the Silverstone Grand Prix, 400,000 people attending over 3 days, including practice qualifying and the main event, obviously today. But as you say, yeah, the back page is dominated by that bombshell news last night that Cristiano Ronaldo, after just 1 year, says he wants out of Manchester United. He signed a 2-year deal last summer. He just wants to play. I mean, I know the guy who wrote the story for the Times, Duncan Castles, known him 20 years, really good bloke, and he said to me that, you know, over 19 years, Ronaldo has played Champions League since leaving Sporting Lisbon, going to Manchester United, going to Real Madrid, going to Juventus, back to Man United. He doesn't want to play in the Europa League, which is kind of the second-level European competition, when he's got 3 years left in the game. He believes he can play till he's 40, and he believes that he needs to be playing at a club at Champions League level. At Manchester United finished 6th last season. They finished 36 points below Manchester City, their great rivals, who won the league. They are nowhere near even challenging for the top 4, let alone challenging for the league title. And Cristiano Ronaldo regards, with the new manager coming in, he was dissatisfied last season with the fact that they brought in an interim manager, which didn't really solve the problem. He doesn't see his future there. He looks at his options and thinks, they can't deliver. This club, this mammoth club, Manchester United, the biggest club in the world, they cannot deliver what I want to do for the remainder of my career. And I think that Chelsea is a good option for him to possibly go to.
There's some ambition to play till 40 at the
highest
level. I mean, that is incredible. Well, he's got the fitness, hasn't he? I mean,
we are entering that era now. Sports science is taking us into the zone where players are going to be, all sports. We've seen it in tennis. Roger Federer is planning on coming back from a knee injury, age 41 in September. He'll probably be in top 10 again in terms of the seed, in terms of the world rankings. We could see that. Football as well. Messi, Lionel Messi's playing for PSG. He shows no sign of letting up. There are plenty of players. They used to be the exception 20 years ago, the ones that played at 36, 37. But if you look, I mean, you think of George Best, for example, he retired at 27.
No surprise given his lifestyle.
I know, that's absolutely true.
Sports science had not there, all of that.
No, you're absolutely right. But then Ronaldo, there's the option of him going. I think United would be comfortable selling him with 1 year left of his contract. If he went abroad, I don't think they'd be comfortable selling him to a rival. But yeah, as you mentioned there, the Chelsea thing, Todd Bowley, the new owner, he's taken over post the sanctions. He reportedly met with Jorge Mendes, who is Cristiano Ronaldo's agent, just a couple of weeks ago. Oh, okay. There's talk that he could go there. Bayern Munich would represent probably a happier solution for Manchester United, because at least he wouldn't be playing against him in that league. It would also give Ronaldo the chance to win a league in Germany, which he's not already done. You're pretty much guaranteed to win the Bundesliga with Bayern Munich. They're selling their top scorer as well, their legendary striker, Robert Lewandowski. So I could see him going there. But also, we must just mention a few other sports as well.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Silverstone. Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely enormous. We had this scandal this week of Bernie Ecclestone, 91-year-old Bernie Ecclestone, making some quite unedifying, distasteful comments about Lewis Hamilton, as well as Nelson Piquet, who drove for Ecclestone back in the 70s, using the N-word actually on a podcast, which is just unacceptable, beyond the pale in terms of stupidity. And he's had his membership of the British Racing Drivers Club suspended. Hamilton's had to move on from that, and he's had to, a busy programme of events this weekend. He looked good in qualifying yesterday. He finished down in 5th on the pole, but he's probably not going to do much this season. He's been suffering a hangover from last season and the way that last season's championship finished. But he did have something to say about Max Verstappen. He said that it's unacceptable that he was booed on the way to into the Silverstone, which is not very British. I suppose we're used to it in sport, are we? Maybe we're getting a bit sensitive, but it was just unusual for someone to stick up for a great rival like that. Someone.
But I think to his credit.
To his credit, yeah, absolutely right.
To his credit.
It's right. And then, and tennis last night as well. Did you see any of it?
I saw the highlights of the Kyrgios match, and that was pretty lively, wasn't it?
But it was, because it was a real throwback to the Connors and McEnroe era. Yeah. Who do not like each other one bit. They used to play doubles together. There's no love lost at all, even after the game.
Carried on, didn't it, into the press conference?
It did. I mean, it was ended in 4 sets. Kyrgios won in 4 sets. He played really, really well, despite all the chipping away at the umpires and the officials and the line judges.
I just don't think the umpires are tough enough. They take that abuse from the likes of Kyrgios, as they used to do from McEnroe. I long for an umpire to say, you're not getting away with that. That's a violation. You're disqualified. But they don't seem to do that in tennis.
It's almost like, it's Nick. He's a little bit like that.
Yeah.
You can't do that. The rules have to.
Well, then he'll do it again and again and again.
And if kids are watching it as well, they think, well, my hero's getting away with it. Why shouldn't I do it?
It's really uncomfortable watching the way he carries on. It really is. It's a throwback to. Well, it is McEnroe. Is absolute worst. It worst. But
super brat.
What was interesting though was that the crowd. The more he played up, the more he kind of chipped away at the officials, the more the crowd were getting on side. It's very un-Wimbledon-like.
Yeah.
But to be fair, he was producing some brilliant tennis. I mean, he was a set down and got it back to 1-1. He complained that Tsitsipas had hit the ball into the crowd and should have suffered a default, which means effective disqualification. He said, if that was me, I'd have been out. I'm not so sure about that.
No, I'm not so sure about that.
I thought they might have gone, good one, Nick. You're good for tennis. But
well, look, guys, we're going to have to leave it there because we've come to the end of the show. Unfortunately, it's flown back as usual. But you've been watching and listening to The Political Correction. Join us next Sunday at 10 a.m. for 2 hours of discussion, debate and analysis of the week's biggest stories. See you then.
Right, looking ahead to today's weather, the UK is looking like another day of sunshine and showers, though some places will stay dry, so let's take a look at the detail. There'll be increasing amounts of sunshine across southwest England by lunchtime, with just a few lingering showers. Temperatures rising to 17 by midday. Light winds for all.
Sunny spells and scattered showers at lunchtime across southeast England and the London area. Still the odd heavy shower possible. Temperatures of 19 degrees Celsius.
To Wales now. Wales is going to see a mixture of sunshine and showers. Some could still be on the heavy side. Light winds and temperatures reaching 18 degrees.
Scattered showers for the Midlands, some possibly heavy in places. However, there will be plenty of sunny spells in between the showers, helping to lift temperatures to around 18 degrees Celsius, light winds as well.
North East England will see a mix of sunny spells and scattered heavy showers this lunchtime. Some sunshine developing at times too, temperatures slowly lifting to around 17.
It is a mixed picture for Scotland at midday. A mix of sunshine and showers, those heaviest and most frequent across the south of the country.
Scattered showers continuing for Northern Ireland, rather cloudy skies, but there will be some sunshine which will help lift temperatures to about 16. Little breezy along the north coast too.
Showers will clear eastwards through the rest of the day, allowing dry weather to move on. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of Sunday.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.